So I'm going to ask my panel to come up. We've got Amy White, Helen Kelly, Amy Hannon, and Ricardo Wagner. If you guys want to come up for me. All right, thank you. Have a seat, guys. Okay, so this is about diversity and inclusion. What we want to do is explore the idea as a topic. Each one of these individuals is connected with diversity and inclusion, and I'm going to have to figure out how to turn this on because I have your introductions, so we're going to come back to that in a second. But we're going to spend some time talking as a group as well, okay, exploring it as well. So first of all, diversity and inclusion. Let's look for definition. Okay. Just give us your name, the organization, and your connection to diversity and inclusion. Your name and the organization and your connection to diversity and inclusion.
Okay, my name is Josephine Yam. I'm CEO and co-founder of B3 Canada, Building Breakthrough Boards. And our relationship with diversity and inclusion is we provide large corporations with an innovative diversity and inclusion program by matching their employees with nonprofit boards for leadership and development and diversity and inclusion. Great.
So you're eminently qualified to give us a brief definition of diversity and inclusion. Just off the top of your head, first thing that comes to mind. Because we're going to spend a lot of time talking about it. There's no wrong answer. Well, there is, but don't get it wrong.
In a very simplistic way, diversity is how all we are very different and unique, and inclusion is how all our individual differences can come together in a unique, beautiful whole.
Okay, that was pretty good. I like that. All right, we're going to keep adding to that with our wonderful panel here. We're going to start down at the far end with Helen Kennedy. You don't have to do anything yet. I'm just going to actually read this, so you're safe. EGAL's Executive Director in 2070, yes, in the future, 2007. She's the first woman to hold her position, the position as the Executive Director. She joined the organization with 22 years of experience. This was really interesting. She's a founding member of the Canadians for Equal Marriage, which many view as instrumental in bringing legal marriage to, what's the technical term for marriage equality? Just turn those two words around. Marriage equality in Canada is one of the first countries to recognize that. So glad to have you with us, Helen. And we're going to ask you to tell us a little bit more about yourself in a moment. So over to Amy. Amy Hannon currently leads the Inclusion and Diversity team at TD Bank across Canada. TD is well known for their focus on LGBTQ community and works with TD's Diversity Leadership Council to develop and execute strategies impacting TD's own employees, customers, and communities. Great. Thank you for being with us, Amy. Next, we have Amy White, who's the Head of Global Community Relations and Public Affairs at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. She's responsible for strategic communications, public affairs, community philanthropy, and emphasis on the communities and regions where the foundation has employees and partners around the globe. And just so you know, the foundation, it's a large foundation, 1,600 employees-ish. Kind of goes up and down, all right? And before that, what was the organization that you worked with?
Most recently.
I don't know. Technology, yeah.
Before I joined the foundation, I was a political and outreach director for our Washington State Marriage Equality Campaign and then Pride Foundation, the U.S.'s largest open foundation.
Perfect, okay. And now we have Ricardo Wagner. We sat these two together because he's Microsoft. He's a senior product marketing manager at Microsoft Canada. And I ran out of words there. So if you could tell us a little bit about what your connection is with diversity and inclusion at Microsoft.
I'm part of the Diversity and Inclusion Initiative at Microsoft, and I lead the disability group. Everything related to disability and accessibility, that's my core responsibility as part of the diversity and inclusion conversation in Canada.
Excellent. Okay, so we got a bit of a definition. We know who we're going to be talking to. All right. We're going to move over to the panelists right now, but let me just tell you this diversity and inclusion issue is of paramount importance in corporate America, corporate Canada, and all around the world. People are looking at these issues. And weirdly, the private sector has moved into a sort of leadership role by developing these courses, asking people to go through, looking at technology that removes the bias from the hiring, promotion process, and all of that kind of thing. I want to read this one quote, and then we're going to watch a clip that just blew me away. I saw it at a conference in DC about 3 weeks ago, and then we're going to move to some discussion with our panelists, okay? So if one considers the fact, this is a quote, this is not my words, if one considers the fact that organizations now operate as networks, it becomes even clearer that diversity and inclusion can reinforce organizational performance. New research by Deloitte, which we looked at, and other academic institutions, demonstrates that diverse and inclusive teams are more innovative, engaged, and creative in their work. And that's not just Deloitte producing that kind of information. Accenture is producing it. All the big five, big eight, however you talk about them, are producing it. And it's not just a good thing for our employees. We're actually seeing D&I, diversity and inclusion, as a business benefit. Okay? So much so that Procter & Gamble produced this video, which we're going to take a look at. And I'm sorry, this is about to make your suntan go blue a little bit, but let's put that on.
Who said that?
The lady at the store.
That is not a compliment.
Listen, it's an ugly, nasty word, and you are going to hear it. Nothing I can do about that. But you are not going to let that word hurt you. You hear me?
There are some people who think you don't deserve the same privileges just because of what you look like. It's not fair. It's not. Remember, you can do anything they can. The difference is you gotta work twice as hard and be twice as smart.
Come straight home after practice. You got your ID? Yeah. Guess I stopped you. How's your review?
We're good.
You good?
Yeah,
you see?
we're good.
Okay. Good. Now, when you get pulled over,
I'm a good driver. Okay.
baby,
Don't worry.
this is not about you getting a ticket. This is about you not coming home.
I'm gonna be okay. Right? Okay.
It's not fair. But you keep showing up.
You are not pretty for a black girl. You are beautiful, period. Okay? Don't ever forget that.
Okay, great. Thank you. If you wouldn't mind having a seat. How many people have seen that video before? Okay. Just a couple observations about that and being in Canada. Obviously,
Welcome
an American.
To Possibilities. I speak truth to power without.
We're going to
so
go right to the next one. Because the internet thinks, no, Chris, just be quiet. We're going to move on.
Where it features African American.
Actually, it's interesting. They interview some employees, and they have a whole series, this series that they put out there. But it seems like a very American issue to, I think, a lot of Canadians, what's the content covered there. How many Americans do we have in the room? You flew in for this. Okay, great. Great representation. Thank you for that. What's really interesting, and I'll just say this before we move on, from my work in Halifax, the black-white divide in Halifax is distinct. And it is a part of the warp and woof of that community. Halifax, the British brought a number of people up from Jamaica, made them build the Citadel, the big fort there, and then shipped them off to a pile of rocks in the middle of nowhere and called it even. And it has not been even ever since. There's a big divide in that community. Even here, a friend of mine, Marina Willits, is a vice principal of a school here in Toronto, and she would tell you that is as true for Canada as it is in the United States. We as Canadians tend to disobligate ourselves to the weight of it sometimes because we weren't involved in the same history exactly. But it is an interesting and prevalent issue to be dealt with. And you'll notice we do not have anybody besides Ricardo who is, vaguely Latino, I assume, right? Okay. No, he's wholly Latino. We don't have much. We're not here to instruct anybody on the issues represented by different groups. What we are here to do is explore the topic itself, why it matters, and how possibly getting involved in the community and creating bridges between in and out groups could help address this huge issue for business in a new and innovative way. So with that, let's start again, Helen, if you don't mind. We'll hand it all the way down. And if you wouldn't mind just telling us a little bit about your experience, what you do, maybe just 3 or 4 minutes to kind of orient us on your voice, and then we can go down the line and then jump into some questions. And at that point, I hope it's very back and forth, very conversational.
Sure. Thank you, first of all, for the opportunity to be here. It's very interesting, and it's a real privilege. I'm the Executive Director of EGAL, which is Canada's LGBTQI2S human rights organization. And for those of you who say that the acronym is too long, we agree with you, but we believe in the acronym, and we believe in spelling out the acronym. So for those of you who may not know what the acronym means, L, what does L? G, B, T, Q, I. Excellent. A few people who know what that is. 2S, two-spirited. So you'd be surprised how many people actually can't say those words out loud. A lot of people still feel shame around lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer and questioning, intersex, and two-spirit. So at EGAL, we've been around since 1986. We've taken 12 cases to the Supreme Court of Canada to advance rights for the LGBTQI2S people in Canada. We've successfully won them all. We've taken 24 cases through the lower courts in Canada. We've had success there as well, but not as successful as the Supreme Court. And our job basically is to shift a culture. It's to shift a culture to one of tolerance to acceptance. And it's to change the hearts and minds of people throughout our society to be more inclusive of LGBTIQ2S people. This is an amazing video. Imagine if the child was trans. Imagine if the child was a lesbian. Imagine if the child was gay. And it's that intersectional piece of the identities that we work with. And we work with organizations like yours to help you systemically change the culture in your organization to make it more inclusive so that people can bring their whole selves to work. So you don't have to do this on your own. We don't expect you to be experts around the queer community or the LGBTIQ2S people and their needs. What we do expect is that you're going to be open to the conversation. And I think that's really important. People feel that in Canada we have everything. We have great legislation. Yes, we have great legislation. But we don't have that piece to support the legislation and make our society a safe and inclusive space for LGBTIQ2S people. And that's what we do at EGAL. We try and shift that culture to make it safe for everybody.
Perfect. Thank you, Helen. Shift that culture. We're going to come back to that. Amy.
Thank you. I'm also very pleased to be here, and I can attest to the great work that EGAL does. So my story, close to 20 years ago, I sort of stumbled into a role that included inclusion and diversity in the corporate sector. And so I think my perspective is often one of, a little bit of a long view. It's not a new issue for me. And one of the things I'd like to just bring to the conversation is that as we talk about what's holding us back, one of the things I'm really encouraged by is one of the things that's not holding us back, and that is, it's no longer holding us back, and that is a sense that it doesn't matter. So if you go back, there are people in the room who would remember 10 years ago and 15 years ago and 20 years ago when if you asked CEOs, is this a critical, mission critical issue to your company, you would get no's and a few somewhats. And now I think the data is saying 69% saying it is important or very important, and I bet the other 30% are saying somewhat. There aren't too many people who are saying this doesn't matter at all. So I think we need to recognize that that's a huge asset. And shout out to the community investment professionals in the room who have contributed to that, because as an internal diversity and inclusion specialist, I'd say, many of us felt like lone voices within the larger corporate environment. And, I think, as you mentioned, kind of stuck in HR, not being seen as being, central to the mission of the organization. And it was through some of the partnerships and some of the work that community investment professionals did to, the research, pointing out the business case. Now there are multiple studies, many of which, some of which are now being done by for-profit organizations, but initially they were not. They were being done by not-for-profit and community organizations. And the work, in the P&G video is an example of work that very impactfully brings into the organization, and not just into P&G, but into all organizations, a much greater awareness of the issues that we need to address. So, that I'd say is sort of looking backwards. There's certainly lots of work to do, and I think there are lots of things that are still holding us back. And I, am, I guess from my perspective, counting on the community and investment professionals in the room to continue the good work to address the issues that we're still facing.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you, Amy.
Hello. I also am thankful to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'm Amy White. I work at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is also a pleasure and an honor. And unlike the two folks previous to me, I am not necessarily directly engaged with our D&I practice at the foundation. But when I came into my role, that is public affairs and community relations, I was suddenly handed a very large grant-making portfolio. And my philosophy has always been that I am not the best person to be making the grants to communities that I don't know anything about. And so very quickly, we developed a partnership with our human resources team where, in fact, our D&I work is still sort of buried. To say that the best people to make decisions about community investments as it relates particularly to identity-based communities, so whether that's the Black community, the LGBTQ community, were the employees in partnership with those community organizations. And I am one person with a small team, and we can't maintain all those relationships. So I think as a general practice, the foundation we've tried really hard to shift our D&I work to be as community-based as possible. And I think if I have value to add to this conversation in the sense of why we have taken a different approach is that in the States, I really do think employee resource groups through the years have held a very, very important place in corporate America in particular, to give voice to a particular experience, to build mentorship, to build opportunity, to create advocates inside of companies. And I think the next evolution of ERGs, or whatever your company might call them, is to get them out of the building, is to turn those internal networks into external advocates for your company, for your business, but also for each other and for the issues that you are addressing internally, externally. So my team takes that very literally and makes grants in partnership with employees, which is one of the most painful things I've ever done. They all have lots of ideas, and they all think they're experts, as we all do. But it's one of the most valuable things we've done as it turns to how we think about both our public relations presence in each of the markets, but also in long-term sustainable relationship development with these organizations, is that they no longer have a relationship with just me or someone on my team as their grant maker, but an entire network of employees.
Great. Thank you, Amy. How many people here belong to an ERG at your workplace, or just a couple? Or whatever you call it. There are a couple different names out there. Okay. There's 4 or 5 of us. Okay, interesting. We'll come back to that. Ricardo.
Yeah. So I worked for Microsoft for 11 years. I joined Microsoft Brazil in 2006. 6 years ago, I moved to Canada. Ever since working as a product marketing manager, as an evangelist for technology, showing trends in the modern workplace, and really excited with everything that can help to empower people to do more. The aha moment and the personal story that brought me to diversity and inclusion and working with people with disability. I'm an ambassador of a program at Microsoft called My Skills for Africa. Basically, Microsoft employees can volunteer for a week or two in some specific projects in different countries in Africa. And I had the privilege to go to Rwanda. And in Rwanda, in the countryside, I was just with a class of students, and a teacher told me they are struggle to read. Most of them, they have dyslexia, and this is something that is really hard for them to follow. So they are in a special class here. So that's why they are not close to the other groups in different ages. So interesting. Are you familiar with the tool called OneNote Learning Tools? Of course not. And yes, as I said, we're doing a bad job as a marketeer promoting things that are for free to help people with dyslexia. Let me show how it works. So long story short, they implement this technology, and kids were able to read from 4 words per minute to 28, and later 163, and it was tremendous. So not just from this story, it's replicated in many different schools. And for me, it was an aha moment to say, wow, this is dyslexia. And I came back and I started to learn all the different kinds of disability that impacts people and make them all struggle to perform and show their ability. Not sure if you guys know, 70% of the disabilities are invisible to the eye, 70%. We may have people here with disability that we don't know, and they may not disclaim because they don't want to be tagged. And that's something that we learn. Have an inclusive dialogue inside Microsoft Canada. We invited employees to have an open conversation, and it was quiet. People didn't want to disclaim and talk and say, hey, this is safe, you can trust, we are here to help. And then we start to realize that we have a big problem to address, not only in our company, but help our community. Right now we have 4 initiatives that I'm glad to be leading with a great team. One is to better educate managers and employees about disability, make sure that people understand and feel comfortable to talk about the subject. Second one, accommodation policies. Remember everyone that we have permanent disability, temporary disability, and situational disability, so we can deal and accommodate in all different types of disabilities. Inclusive hiring, so we are looking to hire people with disability in a happy to discuss with partners and other companies in the market how to do best practice. That's something we are looking. And the other one, which I'm screaming from my side because this is matching with the thing I do as a product marketing, is to showcase, highlight all the free available accessibility tools that it's embedded in our technology and people are not quite aware. Like you can operate your Windows operational system with your eyes for free. You can just talk about learning tools, speech recognition. So if you need to make a presentation in Quebec, PowerPoint can promptly translate to you. You speak in English, you can see in French. But this is good for someone from Canadian Hear Society to say, I can now finally follow a presentation. And you see, wow, we have a technology that is addressing one thing here and has another effect here. So that's the kind of excitement we're seeing. And yeah, that's the excitement we bring. Sorry.
Thank you, Ricardo. Do you know the stat? How much software do you guys give away each year?
I don't have the stat to give, but every...
Like $1.5 billion, right?
Every single employee, we can make specific donations if we want. We have a specific department for philanthropy that can address and help specific communities, by the way.
Right. And the way it works, if I got this right, it's 4% of retail. You give it out through an organization called TechSoup all over the world. How many nonprofits are here? Okay. If you're buying Microsoft products, you're making a mistake. They want to give it to you for free.
We have non-for-profit offers for free, and it's especially some special offers for non-for-profit organizations as well. Yeah,
okay.
Thanks for reminding. I'm not selling anything here, by the way. So
it's free. There's no selling at all. Okay, it might be a pitch, but there's no selling. Okay, diversity training in the United States alone in 2016, $6 billion went into it. Right. The private sector, this is my first question, the private sector is taking a leadership position with the production of values like this video, by investing that kind of money in workforce and training. They're not the leader, as Helen pointed out. She's been at this for a long time, working with the private sector. But the private sector is doing a lot of heavy lifting because they can do that. They've got the influence, they can open the doors, and they have this workforce to expose to these concepts and even the phrase diversity and inclusion. I would love a couple of us just to, what's your response to the private sector taking a leadership role in this topic versus governments or civil society, which may be seen as moving back and forth?
Well, it probably goes without saying that everybody has a role in this. Nobody owns it, but what I'd say from my experience is that some of the areas where the private sector can make a huge impact is starting to address issues that are, as you said, over the horizon. So, the first, when you think about the Bell Let's Talk campaign, you have mental health and mental health stigma that, nobody's talking about, and a big corporation takes its name and lends it, in a very visible way to that issue. And that creates a certain kind of momentum that no amount of regulation or legislation or community funding or advocacy, grassroots work is going to do. It provides a certain air cover. And when I think of, many, many years ago when, TD decided to sponsor Pride and nobody else was there, that was one of those statements that said, that said it's okay, come on in. More recently, our sponsorship of the Black Experience Project is, a way of both generating important data that organizations need to know about, but also saying this is a really critical issue in our Canadian cities, not just in the U.S., the extent to which, our Black community citizens are having a different experience than our non-Black community citizens, and we need to illuminate that. So I do think that there is a role that corporations can play, and because people think of corporations as a very conservative element of society, when corporations join the party, it says something. It says this is no longer a marginal issue. This is no longer an issue that, is only of interest to, one sector. Mm-hmm. We're now, this is something that, for better or for worse, is something that we need to address in the mainstream and with those kinds of investments.
Air cover kind of says you don't need to be afraid. No, I would love to hear from Helen on this. Go ahead.
Well, I think completely agree with Amy, but I think it has to be authentic. I think people will see through it very quickly if there is a lack of leadership at the top. I think, with the experience that we have had with TD, for example, the leadership stems and it comes from the top. And there is a risk associated with aligning yourself with a particular issue, especially when it has to do with the LGBTIQ2S community. Society in general is not at the level of some corporate leaders. For example, Ed Clark, the previous CEO and president of TD Bank, took a risk when he went out on a limb and did a certain amount of work to be more inclusive of LGBTI people in his workplace. And, the economic benefits are there. The study after study has shown that when you can bring your whole self to work, you're more productive. We know that LGBTI people are very well educated, but they stop at middle management because they're afraid to come out. They cover. And when you're covering, you're not yourself. You're hiding something. And so it's really important for organizations to embrace diversity in all of its facets, in all of its colors, and all of its identities, because you're not getting your full value from the people who are coming and spending the majority of their days with you. So we look to corporate leaders to advance this work because they have access to networks that NGOs don't have access to. They can change political perspectives. They can change political minds. And a lot of this is based in politics.
Okay. That's great observations, which brings us to this is why it's a priority. This is the role the private sector can play. But HBR last year published an article, Why Diversity Programs Fail. And they demonstrated that when you require diversity training, hiring practices become less diverse. People dig their feet in. 5 years later, after required training in diversity programs, there were, a 9% drop in this group of companies in having black women in mid-level manager roles. And it's because we react to the idea that we might be racist. So we double down on not being that way and not revisiting something called implicit bias. And that's what we're going to go to next, okay? People tend to respond with an anger, resistance. Somebody came up to you and said that was a racist thing to do. That would trigger a very negative emotion in you. I don't think that needs to be proved. Many participants report increased feelings of animosity towards their outgroup. So Ricardo puts on a training and they address some issues. People are forced to look at themselves and think through their own disposition, their own implicit bias, and the behavior gets worse towards the group that you're trying to engender. Not for everybody, not all the time, but enough people that statistically it can be corruptive. So voluntary, the point of this article is diversity trainings need to be voluntary, right? People need to be open and want to learn about it. That creates a problem, right? Because businesses don't really do voluntary training very well. So let's go to implicit bias for a second. Amy, you're going to explain that concept. Is that good? Or do you want me to do it?
I think you have it really nice.
Yeah, I've got it written out here. Okay, so it's based on the implicit association test. And basically, it's a free test. You should take it online, but just be prepared to feel bad afterwards. So have a glass of wine there. But it's a bias that's it's inside of you, but you can't find it by thinking about it, the same way as you can't control your heart by thinking about it. Okay, it's happening. You're doing it. You just can't do anything about it. You can see it when it happens. And the way this test works, one of the ways this test works, is they put words that go together. So let's practice this for just a second, and then we're going to go over to you guys. And the question I want to ask is, how can I'll get to that in a second. I'm going to say blue, you're going to say sky. Okay. I'm going to say butterfly, you're going to say caterpillar. Okay. I'm going to say tornado, you're going to say hurricane. Tornado, you're going to say another word. Come on. Dangerous. Disaster, you're going to think. All right. What we don't do is put disaster with lovely and hurricane with pretty. Right? We don't put those words together. They don't go together. No, and your brain is wired to do this word association. Your neurons work this way. This is how we get stereotypes. Really quick reactions because you put a bunch of words together. Implicit bias test changes it. And I just experienced this morning. They have this picture of a guy, a dude at a corporation, and they've got professional, provider, strong, stalwart, whatever. And then they had a professional woman. It was nurturer, supporter, team player, you know, that kind of thing. And you're like, oh, that's wrong. That's wrong. But then during her talk, she switched the pictures, and it felt wrong. At one level, I knew it was wrong. But when you switch it and have her with those words and him with those words, that feels wrong. Okay? And that's what the implicit bias test gets you to that kind of awareness kind of thing. Which brings us to community investment. That barrier, voluntary, and one of the key elements to actually dealing with our implicit bias and moving the needle on diversity and inclusion is contact with our outgroup. So Amy White at Gates represents a little bit of both. Her history in the past and some of her work in the community, and then her role with community investment. How do you see those two things possibly working together well beyond what they are now, with the understanding that at the end of the experience, when we're asking people to think about what their implicit bias, we feel bad. And I don't think there's one person here involved in employee volunteering and community investment that wants a bad feeling at the end of giving or doing. So how do you think about that. And she's not prepped for this question, so you're getting some original content here.
Woo!
And just hold the mic up so we can all hear you.
Yes, especially our friends on the phone or wherever they are in the internet.
Internet.
So back to what I said in our introductions is I'm one of the few people, I swear to God, that came to the Gates Foundation that had actually worked in an NGO before, who had received grant money and knew what that was like. And so I think that perspective helped me come to my role as a grant maker and someone that was working not just on community relations, but on sort of engagement and authentic community investment with a really different lens than some of my really smart and really lovely colleagues. Because it has to be based in authenticity. It has to be based in real relationships. And so I would say from the get-go, and we also have a little bit of a nuanced company because we're the world's largest foundation that working for the world's richest guy. So there's some benefits that we have that maybe some other people don't. Okay. So what we have struggled to do is that as practitioners, we try really hard to let people be uncomfortable. And that, as a program manager that wants people to feel good and come back and retain them and all that jazz, really is hard. But our first step in this was, as I mentioned earlier, we have invited employees into grant making with the commitment, voluntary grant making, with the commitment that once they are involved, they have to continue to stay involved with those organizations that they make grants to. So anybody could come and make the Latino community grant investment. You don't have to be Latino, but what you're doing is committing. So what we said is come voluntarily do this and learn about something different than yourself, whether that's just an NGO because you're a fancy academic that's never done on-the-ground work, or if you're actually not Latino or LGBT or whatever the case might be, come and learn and invest. But part of your commitment is your time. And so that was step one. And then we evolved a bit into, we do have an emergency response sort of community-based piece of our work that originally was sort of designed around, there's a flood, there's a tornado, save the kittens, but has in the last, unfortunately, probably 18 to 24 months evolved into the Pulse nightclub shooting, to different tragedies in other offices that we have, to Black Lives Matter movements. And so very quickly, I think often a more corporate response is let's just give money to those things. Let's give money to the community-based organization that's working on Pulse, and it'll be better. Well, we very quickly said that's not authentic. We can do that. We should. We have money. We should give it away. And what are we going to do internally? So that has actually started our journey a bit more internally, where now we do voluntary conversations. They're not trainings. I'm not a big fan of trainings, but we do a lot of conversations. We have sort of dorkily, if that's a word, called them courageous conversations, to talk about Black Lives Matter, to talk about the things like the video that we saw, to start to have these conversations where people, in a voluntary way, but in a very public way, are sharing both their experience as well as their sort of uncovering their bias. And now, as a result of that, particularly through some of our work with the Black Lives Matter conversations last year, we've started to voluntarily bring in speakers, and not necessarily trainings, but additional ways to keep the conversation alive. And I think that's where, back to your previous question, Chris, and then I'll pass it off, but I think that's where corporate America has the greatest internal opportunity, is that you can start a conversation, but you're not going to finish it because you're not at the kitchen table with the kid, right? But if you can start it at work and give some cover to it and expose people to new ideas, and then also support the community-based organizations that are doing that work with families and children in your community, then there's this continuum that can happen that is sort of, it's real and it's authentic. And so we, through our HR team and my team specifically, had over the last about year have spent a lot of time with our CEO basically saying we're going to be okay with people being sad. Yep. And we're going to be okay with people crying, and we're not going to try to go fix it. It's not our job to fix it. It's our job to raise it.
Right. Okay, that's good. Yep.
I agree, but I also think we need to be real in terms of the work that the NGO does. We do a lot of work in Catholic schools, and we're not top of mind in the Catholic institution when in these conversations. But what we have done is we've formed very strong partnerships and alliances with allies within the Catholic system, and we have changed our language to accommodate and meet the institution where it's at in order to change the hearts and minds so people will accept and be more accepting and inclusive. So I think there's a responsibility for all of us really to be prepared to have a difficult conversation with someone who we don't traditionally have lunch with.
And that's the context is absolutely key. And one of the things that we'll explore tomorrow is how to create a context for that contact to occur outside of the workplace through community investment. Ricardo is going to add on to this, and then we've got about 6 minutes. I want to get some questions from the room and dialogue from the room, and we'll start with you, Alison. Okay.
We went through training, and one of the things that was really interesting for us is realize that people don't know what they don't know. It's simple as this. And we make assumptions. We assume things. And this is the wrong thing to do. So one of the things that we start is bring awareness and provoke a conversation. So let's talk about it. Tell me what you're feeling. Tell me what you think. And how can we make a bridge to make this conversation an interesting conversation for both of us. And the article says diversity programs are failing because they are missing the word inclusion. Mm-hmm. If you don't drive diversity with inclusion, you're not going to have a good program in place. So that's another thing that I would like to compliment. Just don't assume. Don't bring assumptions to this conversation.
Yep. Okay, good. Now we're going to take some questions. Alison's going to kick us off, but that's a good point. I've heard it described this way. Diversity is when you get invited to the party. Inclusion is when someone asks you to dance at the party.
Thank you very much. Whole bunch of thoughts, but so change is uncomfortable. Mm-hmm. It just is uncomfortable. And in the corporate sector, we embrace innovation, and innovation is uncomfortable for lots of people because it means change. So I like to think about this more on a spectrum. So when I think about disability, I don't actually use that word. I use ability because we all have various levels of ability, right? I mean, you should see me at basketball. Horrible. Like, you know, so when you think about how do we create space for that? And so, Helen, I also use the phrase around inclusive, bringing our whole selves to this work, which I love. And when I say that sometimes in the corporate sector, people say, I can't do that. I can't be vulnerable. I can't admit my weaknesses, or I can't admit how I'm different because it won't be received. So I'm wondering if the panel could comment on what we do to create safe spaces, not only for challenging and difficult conversations, but actually how we tell stories of success or how we show all of that. So any kind of best practices around how that's played out. Sorry, that was a bit long. Short. And I didn't introduce myself. My name is Alison Hewitt, and I'm with the Mars Discovery District, Toronto.
Alice, need to be genuine, as the panel has already mentioned. Needs to be, I would say, from the leadership team down, and if we have these two components, you have a good start point. So that's my contribution to this answer.
Thanks, Ricardo.
Also, speaking again to the community investment professionals, when your company puts significant investment into an issue outside the company, it feels like you're putting your money where your mouth is. And it has a much bigger impact in creating a sense of commitment within the organization to the issue. If you think about Bell Let's Talk, it started with a community investment. It's now becoming more of a movement within the organization for employees to have those kinds of conversations. So I wouldn't underestimate the message that your employees get from things that you do externally. And I think importing speakers from other organizations when your own employees aren't ready to disclose or step up is a first step. And then they start to see how it happens, how it can be done, and how it's received. And nothing bad happened to that speaker. And so then maybe it's going to be okay for me to disclose and step up and share a little bit more about who I am.
Okay, let's go. Okay.
Yeah, vulnerability shouldn't be seen as a weakness. And I think that if, as an organization, you look at your internal policies, you look at everything you do as an organization, your hiring practices, the language you use, the pronouns, taking gender out of the application process. These are all things. This is a long game. This is not, a quick fix. To change this culture is a long time. Takes a long time. So there are a whole bunch of things that you can do, but creating that safe space so people don't feel vulnerable is all part and parcel with the overall holistic approach to this work.
Perfect. Okay, and you don't need to ask a question. You can just have a thought or a reflection. Let's start here. Gabby.
Hi, my name is Gabby from Loyalty One. This question is actually for Helen. So Michelle's stats that she presented earlier talked about diversity and inclusion being really top of mind of CEOs and them taking some accountability for that. But when you were talking about CEOs actually stepping up and being advocates externally outside of their organizations, it seems like there's more U.S. CEOs that are willing to do that, whereas in Canada there's very few, and I think Mr. Clark from TD was the one that popped into my mind of one that was willing to kind of take the risk. What needs to happen in Canada for more CEOs to actually come out and be able to talk and be advocates for a lot of the diversity and inclusion discussions that more and more employees are expecting them to have?
I think that, the changing demographic in terms of the current cohort of workers, the millennials, are starting to push a lot of the CEOs and the corporations to make that change. We're seeing it, and I think that corporations are now starting to realize that this new cohort of employees is not going to settle in one location without checking all of the boxes. But it's more than checking the boxes. It has to be authentic. It has to this diversity and inclusion model. When you're dealing with LGBTIQ2S issues, it's very personal. Society still is not accepting of LGBTIQ2S people, even here in Canada. I mean, we have hate crimes in Canada against our community that are the most violent of any hate crime in the country. And we have politicians, we just elected one or saw in Alberta, Jason Kenney doesn't believe in gay-straight alliances in schools. When you still have that culture of shame and unacceptance around LGBTI people, there's a big risk with putting your logo, attaching it to an organization like EGAL. And to change the mindset and make more people like Ed Clark, it's a cultural thing, and I think the millennials, when you see the economic benefit associated with allowing people to be who they are at work, you're going to get more out of that individual. I hate to say that the economic impact of having a person fully present and engaged in your workplace eventually will also shift. And I think, too, that mentorship programs should be reversed. We should have the younger folks mentoring the senior people so they can, because people are afraid. They're afraid to get it wrong. They're afraid that if they say, transgendered, that someone's going to jump all over them, or they don't understand what intersex is. It's okay to ask.
That's good. Okay, one more thought or reflection over here. Because you volunteered earlier, we will, yes, you get the opportunity.
So if millennials are kind of pushing the issues forward, can I get any of you to theorize why diversity and inclusion, dare I call them scandals, are kind of plaguing young tech companies and the tech sector and these startups? Why do they continue to be issues?
That's a good question.
Like Uber? Who are you talking about?
Twitter, and
nobody say Microsoft, please. Nobody say Microsoft.
Well, and even at Google, the James Damore memo.
I got handed the mic, but not because I necessarily have a good answer. But I do think that people leading are not necessarily the people making change all the time. And having been relatively close to the Uber conversation because of some good friends, it's great ideas come from all over, and then you end up, the U.S. is a great example. You get people who are in leadership positions who suddenly start to realize who they really are. and questions you didn't ask in the interview process or whatever that might be. So I do think that while younger employees are pushing a conversation about where the kinds of places they want to work, they don't necessarily know yet how to change the places they're in. And so I think the reaction is that now we're bringing the Uber example, like there was a public outcry that created change inside the organization that they are still going to muddle through over the next couple of years. But I do think that the ability to leverage their customer base in having, it wasn't just the board dealing with issues, became part of their strategy to make change. And I do think that's similar internally with companies, is that conversations are hard to have, but if you have a critical mass of people who are willing to do it or demand it, I think it changes everything. So I do think, back to the earlier question, is my experience is very U.S.-centric, so forgive me, but I do think the U.S. has been successful because we've tied diversity and inclusion to the company bottom line better than most countries have, is that suddenly there is an economic incentive from a customer base. Best Buy is a great example, to do good and target, I mean, there's dozens of them, to do good in the community because not just your millennial employees, but your millennial customers are demanding that you be a better company.
Good. Okay, so we've got to wrap. I'm really sorry, but I don't expect this conversation to end. We're going to carry it forward and touch on it. Yeah. We're going to, I'm being over.
I'm sorry, I don't think this is working.
Here.
Maybe it is. Is it working? Okay, I've got some questions for the audience. My first question is, what is the cost of recruiting somebody new? In terms of a percentage of that person's salary, what does it cost to recruit somebody new? Anybody know that proportion? Typically it costs about 45% of that person's salary to find somebody new to do that job, okay? That's the first thing. The second thing is, what percentage of training and development budgets are typically utilized in the average corporation every year? What percentage? Very low. Typically less than 10% of the budget that's set out for training and development in any corporation is used on an average year. So as a community investment practitioner, or as the partner of a community investment practitioner, a community partner, who in this room has ever been asked the question, what is the ROI of your work? What's the ROI? That lovely off the hand, oh, what's the ROI? Thank you. Only one person? Two people. Okay, I would say probably more than that. So the wonderful thing about this incredible panel is that they've given us some ideas about how we can make the connection between community investment work and real tangible return on investment in corporations that are needing to recruit people because their corporate culture might not have appealed to the person that has now left the organization, or actually just training people to achieve the leadership characteristics that Michelle Ryder actually outlined for us in that Deloitte report. So even though I have to say that I'm quite disappointed that we have to bring this panel to a close because this is an amazingly dynamic conversation, I just want to thank you because we've made some really important connections to answer that question about what is the ROI